Hello and welcome to this webinar on demystifying the CQC insights from a former inspector. I'm Dr Rachel Stewart, one of the medical legal advisors at the MDU, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Jodie Carr tonight, a former CQC inspector. So we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. So there should be a Q&A box on your screen, so if you could please submit your questions into that, and Jodie will answer as many as she can at the end. Along the top right of your screen, you can access different tools we have available for this live webinar, including a feedback form. We'd be very grateful for your thoughts. So you should receive a certificate of attendance via an email within 5 days of the webinar. The webinar will be available recorded. On-demand version will be available to watch on our website within 5 days. If you experience any tech issues, please can we ask you to leave and rejoin the webinar using the same link. There should be a PDF document linked in the resources box in your dashboard that covers dealing with tech issues. And with that, I'll hand over to Jodie to start.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jodie Carr, and I'm a former CQC operations manager. I used to lead a team of dental inspectors, and before that, I was a CQC inspector of dental practices and GP inspectors. GP practices, apologies. And before that, I was a practice manager. So I've actually been inspected by the CQC twice. So I know exactly how it feels and those anxieties and stresses. I've been the inspector going out and looking at exactly what inspectors look for. And I've been the operations manager that makes those key decisions on any enforcement activity where providers may have fallen short of the regulations. So we've got a really jam-packed agenda today. And I'm hoping that today will boost your confidence with CQC and I can give you some helpful insights. So I'm going to start with some insights from myself and exactly what inspectors look for, how you can share that compliance burden with the team and get the whole team involved, some recent themes from assessments and some practical tips to stay assessment ready all year round, and hopefully some time for some question and answers at the end. So firstly, I'm thinking around the background of a CQC inspection. So on a CQC inspection, or should I say assessment, which I'll get to in a second, there will likely be a CQC inspector, and they are not always from a clinical background. So they will focus more on the governance side of the practice, talking with staff, talking with patients, speaking with your PPG, for example, care homes, a lot of the kind of governance processes of the practice, and they are supported by a specialist advisor who will look at the remote searches of the system, so the clinical aspects. And they are usually, a specialist advisor is from a clinical background, and they will definitely focus a lot more on the clinical side of the practice. Now, it really depends on the size of your practice. So for example, if you have a dispensary in the practice, then they may bring along a medicines management. They may bring along a couple of inspectors, depending on the size of your practice. If you have lots of staff, for example, lots of treatment rooms, or if you have a branch practice. But the focus today is on the CQC inspector role. So frequently asked question is, when and why will I be assessed by CQC? So firstly, inspections are now called assessments, and even on the CQC website, a lot of it will still say inspections, but technically the terminology now is assessments. And I apologize if I say inspections, it's just a force of habit. You know, it's a common word that I used for years, and in the dental sector, they are still calling it inspection. So if I intertwine with the two, then I just apologize in advance. So talking about assessments and the reasons as to why you might be assessed and the different types of assessments that we have. So first of all, we've got the responsive assessment. So this is down to risk, and it's usually, it can be an announced or an unannounced inspection, and sometimes they'll look at kind of select key questions. So remember the Chloes have gone and they've now been replaced with key questions, but still the same, the safe, effective, caring, responsive and well led. But they will focus on one of those key questions, for example, because they are being responsive to risk, responsive to information that they may have received, which I'll talk about on the next slide. You've also got planned inspections, and these can be all of the key questions that they look at, and it can be focused key questions that they look at. Then you have follow-up assessments. Now, ratings as such, the CQC aren't necessarily relying on what the previous rating was anymore, but that previous rating tends to, if it is, for an example, an inadequate practice, have had some sort of enforcement action with it. So the CQC will have to follow up on that enforcement action. So that tends to be a follow-up assessment. And finally, any kind of registration changes that you've had may prompt a visit from the registration team. For example, if you are going to purchase a new practice, for example. When and why will I be assessed? And thinking about this is focusing more on the risk. So those unannounced inspections, that's what most people understandably worry about. So every day the CQC receives thousands of pieces of information. In fact, they actually received nearly 200,000 pieces of information in 2023 and 2024. And of those, 30,000 was safeguarding and 15,000 was speaking up. So whistleblowing cases, for example. And this is often where risk is raised. So an inspector would review this information, and let's use an example of a GP practice. Their last assessment was 4 years ago and they were rated good. There's been no kind of outliners with their QOF. The data has been quite steady as it kind of comes through. But recently, in the past week or so, there's been some complaints coming through from patients. And then all of a sudden, there has been 2 whistleblowings come through around concerns around cleanliness, for example, or a backlog in tasks, for example. So the CQC, this would raise the level of risk, and CQC would need to get some sort of assurances that the practice, for example, is clean. So they would then look to see what information that they hold on that practice currently. So like I said before, you've got this stream of complaints coming through. You've got these 2 whistleblowers, and they would start to look at the information that they have and consider what they call a decision review. Now, a decision review can be the inspector just simply looking at the information that they have and making an informed decision on the next steps they need to take. And it can be in partnership with an operations manager. So remember my role before as an operations manager, it could be contacting their local operations manager and looking together to decide the next steps. Now, the next steps might not necessarily be crossing that threshold and going out and carrying out an on-site assessment. They could consider getting their assurances through other means. For example, contacting the practice, asking for policies and procedures. In the case of, hearing that there's uncleanliness, it's unlikely they would look to do that. They will consider whether they need to carry out an announced inspection, and that can be a short notice announcement or a normal announcement period of around 2 to 4 weeks, or they could carry out an unannounced inspection. So this is really the purpose of what a decision review is, and I wanted you to understand what that is and what the next steps could be. It's important to note as well, dependent on the information that comes through. So for example, keeping with speaking up, if somebody was to speak up about their contract, for example, or their pay, then the CQC may refer that person and signpost them to, just as an example, ACAS. So they can also look at that information and potentially refer that information to other sources. Now, an unannounced inspection does take place, and they are likely to take place because there is a risk to patients or staff or the public, and it really does depend on the information that has been given. Another frequently asked question is, when I used to go out and be an inspector, is what information do you hold? Now, all of this information on this slide is available on the CQC website, and information, like I said before, comes through from patient feedback. So they give feedback from care on the CQC website. It will come through from there. It will come through from the GP survey, for example, from Health Watch. You've got staff feedback. So it doesn't always necessarily mean staff feedback from where staff are speaking up. It could also be positive feedback. Sometimes staff feedback to the CQC about how positive it was to work at a practice, for example. Any other feedback coming through from the public maybe, or a local care home, for example, your QOF data, and then information from a variety of sources. And I've put a few in there. So for example, a local authority around potential safeguarding alerts, for example. They also obviously hold your previous CQC inspection and the previous notes from that inspection and kind of what that rating was and any notifications that you have submitted. So this slide here, evidence we collect or information we receive at any time can trigger an assessment. So this is taken from the CQC website, and this is around when they will assess practices. And this is key. I can honestly say any practice that I went out to unannounced, they never expected me that day. You know, it's always a surprise. It's not very often someone will wake up that morning and think, I have an urge that CQC are coming in today. It just doesn't happen. So they really can happen at any time, and ongoing compliance really is essential. So please don't wait for that call, just engage your team now. I'm just struggling to move to the next slide. 1 second. So now I'm going to talk about, as an inspector, the kind of first steps that I would take when I was planning an inspection. So this could be planning a risk-based inspection, or planning more of a kind of comprehensive inspection, just a planned inspection. And these are some of the areas that I would consider as an inspector. Now, the purpose of this picture and putting Google Earth, which a lot of people wouldn't even consider, is because I just want you to start thinking about areas that you can control, around thinking around what does the external side of your premises look like. And I've got a bit of a story to tell here. So information came through around waste procedures at a practice, and that the clinical waste was accessible to members of the public. Now, I was already planning on going out to inspect this service, but what was actually really interesting is when I looked on Google Earth, and I always looked on Google Earth just for professional kind of curiosity of where I was going to park. You know, I'm not a great parker, so it's just helpful to see where local parking is. Is the practice accessible, for example? But actually on this instance, I had a look, and on Google Earth, the picture of the bin was there, clear as day, with the clinical waste coming out of the bin. So this showed to me that actually this is an ongoing problem. So I want you to really think about what is actually going on externally. I know you can't control your Google Earth image and when that's kind of put out, but it's worth looking at what you can see every day. So when you walk past your practice, is your clinical waste secure? Is it kept away from, you know, the general public? But also thinking about, it might not necessarily be patients that contact the CQC. It can be, in this instance, the general public. I would, as an inspector, I would consider looking at your website. So first of all, do you have a website? And if you're an NHS practice, you certainly should have one. Are you updating it at least annually? Do you let people know that you're accessible? Thinking around, especially at the moment, people using AI to try and find accessible services. It's really helpful to have if you're an accessible practice on there. Are you accepting new patients? And if you are offering other, say, private treatments, for example, do you have your private treatment list available? And are the prices reflective of what you're offering? Have you got a complaints policy? And if you don't have it on the website, you certainly should have. And do you have a link to the CQC website with your latest rating and your latest report? Because that certainly should be on there as well. Next is online reviews. So yes, as an inspector, I would likely search your practice and look at the online reviews that you have available, which can be from NHS Choices, for example, but also, yes, Google reviews or Trustpilot. CQC are well aware that these are not verified reviews, but what this could tell me is the kind of themes that you have coming up at your practice. So for example, if there was themes around access as an inspector, this could aid me into thinking, right, I might focus a little bit more on access for this practice. Or it could even be perfect 5 stars and some really good ideas of where the practice have gone above and beyond, maybe in the domain of outstanding, for example. And I could use this as an aid to ask the practice, what happened in this scenario? It's also just to see if the practice are responding to them. Now, if you are responding to them, you must maintain confidentiality for that patient and just be very aware of what you are posting back to them. Maintain that patient confidentiality and your professional conduct as well. It's really important to look at the kind of reviews and audit any feedback that you get so you can review themes. Social media. Yes, I will, as I Google the practice, likely look as an inspector at any social media that you have. Now, Not often do GP practices, for example, tend to use social media much, but there are, a lot more TikTok and Instagram and day in the life, for example, that is starting to be put about. And just think about, are you breaching your own infection control procedures by putting this up, or GDPR policies, for example? Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah,
And Rachel,
we
ahead,
know
Rachel.
that social media is a sort of bigger and bigger part of a lot of doctors' lives, and it's actually something that the MDU is doing a webinar on next month. So it's just to mention that if anyone's interested in hearing a bit more about that, we do have a webinar coming up on the 11th of February that's gone live on our website today, and we can link put a link in the, I think our colleague Cam can put a link to that in the resources section as well if anyone is interested in signing up.
Thank you. So yes, staying with kind of first impressions, as an inspector, they will likely Google your practice as well. And a bit of a joke, but other search engines are available, of course. But thinking around kind of Google, I will put in the practice information name if I was an inspector. And really what I'm looking for is, have you had any press around your practice? So if it's good press, you could potentially use that as evidence. And that's something that I would like to explore when I came into the practice. Look at this fantastic thing you did. If it's bad press, that's not necessarily always a bad thing. Let's just consider what you have done to improve from that bad press. So have you got an action plan, for example? Did you conduct a significant event? But it's really worth being open and just consider probably mentioning this first before the inspector comes in. You're aware that this has happened and this is what you've done about it. It just shows a real open culture. I will look, if I was an inspector again, at your statement of purpose and make sure that you've updated that, and make sure if you have any changes that you notify the CQC within 28 days of such changes. Ensure that your registered manager and your nominated individual details are up to date, because this is where the CQC are likely to notify you of the assessment. You don't want to miss that call or email. And now I'm talking about when the inspectors and the rest of the inspection team arrive at the practice. So it really is key that everybody knows that CQC are coming. Now, I know that can't be the case in an unannounced, but in an announced inspection where you know they're coming, make sure you notify all the team who CQC are and what their purpose is. And not just for on the day, but for when that phone call comes through. The amount of times when I was an inspector and would phone a practice and they would think I was a cold caller, for example, and then I would be trying to contact this practice to notify them of an inspection and be told just to call back later because they thought I was a cold caller, for example. So make sure that your reception team are aware of who CQC are. But also just be aware that unfortunately there has been some bogus inspectors who have pretended to be CQC. So on the arrival of when CQC arrive, just make sure that you check that the inspector has their warrant card and you look at the warrant card for the photo. And if the specialist advisor or a member from the medicines management team, for example, attend with them, you check that they have a warrant letter and a photo ID as well. And that warrant letter will have a signature too. So make sure that you look at those. If you have contact from CQC via an email, make sure that it's got the cqc.org.uk in the email. And if it's via phone call and you're ever, concerned, you can contact CQC and check that that person works at CQC. CQC will never ask for bank details. That's one of the most important things to take away from today. They'll never ask for bank details. But make sure, going back to this, that the reception team are aware and that they follow your arrival process. So that could be that you give them a lanyard, it could be that they sign the visitor's book, whatever process you have in place. But it's worth mentioning as well where the nearest fire exits are and if you have kind of a fire drill planned that day. Tea, coffee and biscuits, always a bonus. I'm not saying it's about bribery because it definitely isn't, but it can just really break down those barriers and just, having that 5 minutes over a cup of tea can just, have a good conversation. How are you? And just, really kind of humanize one another. It's worth setting aside at least 30 minutes at the time of their arrival and to show them around the practice, which I'll go through in a second. But really what you're hoping to do is allow them an area to leave their belongings, for example, show them where the toilets are, just make them more comfortable, tea and coffee, etc. They know that you're going to be nervous. That is absolutely normal, but it's worth just telling them. Again, it's humanizing yourself. And just think, have you got any team members that have any additional needs that they need to be aware of? So for example, if somebody has hard of hearing, it's worth mentioning that to the CQC as well. You can choose if you would like to conduct a presentation. Don't make this any longer than 30 minutes because there is so much that the inspector needs to look at on the day. So try to allow for a maximum of 30 minutes and make sure that you've allowed in that 30 minutes some time for some questions and answers. And it's really worth printing that presentation out because it's likely that the inspection team will make notes as you talk through your presentation. Consider your population groups and how you're kind of meeting the needs for your local area, your local population, for example, and start to highlight the brilliant things that you do and any evidence. So not necessarily we meet safe because we have a policy, or we meet effective because we have some procedures. So not necessarily, you can of course do that, but it's really a perfect opportunity to let them know of anything out of the ordinary that you do or anything extra that you do. And if it was me, I would personally focus on around the caring and responsive section. So are you maybe dementia friends or a veteran accredited practice? Lots of areas that you could mention there. Focus as well on areas that you know that you need to improve. It's really, really good to see a practice that openly says, we know we're not perfect, but these are the areas that we are working on to improve, and this is what we're going to do about it. It's just brilliant. So for example, childhood immunizations, which I will talk about further in the slides, but you're aware that the uptake is slightly low. What are you doing to improve that uptake? So really think about areas that you can improve. Just trying to think of another example. Patient involvement as well. How do you involve patients in your practice? This could be a perfect opportunity to talk about your PPG or how you kind of gain feedback ongoing from your patients and community. If you are going to talk about the presentation, a key note that I would definitely say is include an up-to-date mission statement and ensure that that mission statement has been developed with your whole practice team and people who use your services and any external partners as well. So think about the local and wider health and social care community and how you're going to meet those population groups and add that into your mission statement. How are you going to monitor this mission statement as well? Are you going to discuss it at staff meetings, at regular interviews? Really consider how you'll achieve that. So the next stage is where the inspector will walk around the practice. And I appreciate this is a very busy slide because there's quite a lot here. This is a really important opportunity for the inspection team to see how the practice is ran. So, first of all, they're going to be thinking, is it accessible? Is it clean? Are there any kind of hazards or risks around the practice? So trip hazards from carpets, let's just say, or lots of plugs in an electrical socket. The fire exits, they are going to open them. Many times as an inspector, I would go out and fire exits were actually locked. There's not much more I can say. If it's a fire exit, it really does need to remain open. But it's really important as an inspector to, look around the practice. What does it sound like? What does it smell like? Is kind of confidentiality maintained? What can I hear? Are areas out of bounds to patients and visitors? And are they kept out of bounds to patient and visitors? Are people kind of wandering around the practice, for example? Or is the controlled drugs and medicines, are they kept securely? Is there appropriate signage? So think around your fire exit signage that you've probably gone into the practice and never really looked at because you know yourselves the fire exit. But as a visitor and as an inspector, I would certainly be looking at where this points to. And a lot of the time, the fire exit signage will actually point to the wrong way. There will either be a fire exit that's closer or even a fire exit that's not there. So just make sure that maybe tomorrow when you go into your practice, you look actually where the fire exit signs are and you follow them and just make sure that they do follow to the nearest fire exit. Have you got signage for CCTV, for example, letting people know that you are recording them? Have you got medical emergency equipment, and is that, you know, signed so that people would know where that is? And really just how staff are kind of communicating with patients as well. It's a really helpful look around the practice. And here are some kind of red flags as an inspector. So I can't stress enough that you can actually feel it as an inspector. You can feel when staff are hiding. And, you know, I've been there, I've been inspected myself. I know that it is absolutely petrifying. I completely understand. But when you've got people literally shutting the door on you, it makes you think, oh, what's going on here, kind of thing. Or you walk into a practice and everybody's booked the day off. No one wants to speak to you, you know. So just think about making sure that you're not kind of displaying more of a closed culture, and that you know, staff are aware of CQC coming along and the kind of questions they might ask. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but it can really ease their anxieties, for example. And some green flags that I've got here are taking notes. So it's really, really positive to see that not every practice is perfect. And as an inspector, you have that ability to go into multiple practices every single month and be able to see where practices are doing really, really well. And you can share that. So often, if you see a practice manager or a GP partner, for example, taking notes of areas that you identify to look to make those improvements quickly, that is perfect. It's just great to see that they're already planning ahead, that they've got a strong learning culture, that they are kind of being open with you and transparent. And you'll actually see on a lot of reports, it will say action was taken immediately and the provider responded on the day. Because really, when you've been, you know, shown something, if you can act upon the day, that risk is then mitigated. So it's really, really important to make any improvements, if they're identified as improvements needed, as fast as possible. And again, just think about, and I'm aware that if it's an unannounced inspection, this is not always possible, but think about what staff you want available on the day and try to block out time on the day for them. They will want to speak to as many staff members as they can from different avenues of the practice. So make sure that you protect some time in the diary and that you notify them that the inspectors are likely willing to talk to them. It's very easy as an inspector to get very focused in the kind of governance side of things. So if you've got some time aside, make sure that you just prompt the inspector that actually the time is here. So don't be afraid to do that. And it's really worth sharing your assessment date as well with any other services. So for example, care homes. One, so the care home don't think it's their own inspection, but also two, they can really think about any kind of comments that they wish to make about you. Also, your PPG would be another group to notify of the upcoming assessment, because CQC will certainly want to speak to those as well. So now I'm going to move on to why involve the whole team. And many practices already involve the whole team, and that is fantastic. And this is where you can really see those practices that are good and outstanding when the whole team is involved with compliance and ongoing governance and quality improvement, because all of this is just fosters a culture of continuous compliance and improvement. It really builds a team resilience and just less reliant on one person. The amount of times you'd go to practices where they are unfortunately rated inadequate and it would be down to one person that literally does everything. And that one person tends to be a GP who just wants to get on with treating patients. So try not to rely on one person, especially if that person is ill or not around. It's just not ideal. Make sure that you share that compliance with the rest of the team. You're less likely to have gaps because you'll be able to identify shortfalls quickly. Everybody has a role to play in compliance, and it really helps deliver a good service. So thinking about reception and just recognizing the crucial role and the valuable expertise just within your reception team. A lot of the time, as an inspector, I would go out and speak to reception and they would say, I don't know, I'm just a receptionist. But they are not just a receptionist. They are so more than reception, and also your admin team as well. So anybody in this kind of bracket. So you can really think about how you can utilize their skills and areas that they are already addressing. And I've got them on the screen here. So for example, you've got appointments. So as an inspector, I will likely actually ask the receptionist, how do you manage the appointments? You know, how do you book patients in? How are you triaging patients, for example? Thinking around safeguarding, I would likely ask a receptionist if I was an inspector, you know, what systems have you got in place? Do you know how to recognise a safeguarding incident? Think about the fact that receptionists answer those telephones and they might be hearing things go on in the background. They're likely to know the patients that aren't attending, you know, failed to attend secondary care, for example, when they are going through the referrals. They may also witness things in the waiting room, for example. So safeguarding is a really common area where inspectors will ask reception team. They will ask around sepsis, and if reception and even the admin team in certain avenues, do they recognise the signs and symptoms of sepsis, and do they know how to follow the, for example, the Royal College Sepsis Toolkit? And just the environment in general. Can you get your reception team involved in that environment? So thinking around fire checks or just general, you know, overview of, is the practice clean and tidy? I'm not asking your reception team to go around and clean the practice, but it's more just that oversight of what the reception team can see. You know, how are patients in remote areas of the practice? So say you have another waiting area, how are they monitored? Who's kind of monitoring them, for example? Do you have a carers champion? Could they take on a learning disability lead, you know, and who monitors that register? These are all questions that the CQC might ask, but also areas that you can delegate with the team. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. And it's the same again for your HCAs and your nursing staff. So thinking around infection control, often this will be the nursing staff that get asked these questions. But so really you would need an infection control lead, and has that infection control lead got adequate training? So they are likely to be asked questions around, you know, how often are the curtains changed, or how often is the infection control audit carried out, or how often do you look at hand hygiene, for example? They will ask them questions around medicines management. So thinking around your kind of fridge temperatures, you know, do you check the minimum and the maximum? Do you have a data logger? What happens if there's a power cut? These are the types of questions that CQC will ask. So again, delegating and sharing that responsibility and utilising the skills that you've got as well. Thinking around maybe Legionella. So, you know, regular temperature checks, for example, could be another area that they could look at. And the same again for associates and clinical staff, you know, thinking around peer support and clinical supervision. Can they support with this? And as leaders, you may be asked, how do you encourage staff to engage with ideas for improvement and innovation? So can they take part in clinical audits or non-clinical audits, or could they take part in appraisals, for example? So these are all areas that associates and other clinical staff can support with. In particular, just as an example on here, a freedom to speak up, you know, would be a great role to have. Now, I've kind of summarized on the next few slides some top tips, just a lot of areas that are being mentioned in reports. Now, I'm going to go through in a couple of slides around themes in a lot more detail, but here I'm kind of just going to do very speedy top tips. So, for example, here, make sure that you're honest, because your version will be corroborated with others. So, for example, if somebody tells me that they carry out a smoke alarm check on a weekly basis, but it's not them, it's this person, I will then go and ask that person if they carry out the smoke alarm checks. So just make sure that you are being honest, because your version will be corroborated with others. Train your staff on how to operate the emergency equipment. And I don't just mean the medical emergency equipment. They certainly need to be trained on that, but also think about your fire equipment and why they need to be trained on it. You know, anything in your business continuity plan. So for example, if there was a power cut or a data breach or a flood, you know, really practice those through scenarios if you can, and share them in, you know, team meetings and have those ongoing discussions. Carry out fire drills and note them down. This is a very common area that comes up all the time in CQC reports. Note down your staff meeting minutes and share those minutes with team members who are not present. Remove any cleaning products that you have and follow your own COSH procedure. So bleach, for example, should not be accessible in your toilet. Ensure that you've got general oversight of fire, and I will be talking about fire in a lot more detail shortly. Risk assess anything that you find missing. So for example, references or medical emergencies and DBS checks. And don't worry, I'll be talking about this in a bit more detail shortly. Secure any waste that you have. So think about where you're storing it in the practice and making sure that those sharps bins, children aren't able, they're not on the floor, for example. Make sure that the waste outside is chained and kept securely and locked away at the end of the evening. Well, locked away all the time technically. Improve your prescription security, so make sure that any prescriptions, especially at night, are stored in a locked container in a locked room, for example. Make sure that you check your curtains, that they have been changed regularly as per your schedule. Review your fridges, so your temperatures and the data loggers, are they actually working, for example? And make sure that you have an electrical installation condition report. And this is something that needs to be carried out every 5 years, but I'm really noticing that in reports at the moment that it's not necessarily there. Review all of the tasks on your system. CQC will look at the oldest tasks and they will look at the risk of that oldest task. So if you have got some tasks that you need to review, make sure that you have an action plan of when you're going to review them and you've risk assessed them to make sure that there is nothing urgent. Summarizing records, this is another area that comes up very frequently. Make sure that you have risk assessed and you've got a process and you've kind of prioritized dependent on the policy that you choose to put in place, that you're aware of kind of how many records that you've got to summarize, for example, and a date of when you're likely to meet that. Referrals management, make sure that you have a process in place, for example, and ensure that your CQC rating is displayed and is actually correct. That is a regulation, so make sure that your CQC rating is present on the website, but also in practice. Finally, ensure that your complaints procedure is displayed as well. So now I'm just going to talk about some themes from assessments. I'm just going to leave this slide for 1 second while I take a drink. So I looked at reports from November 2025 and January 2026. So these are reports that have been published during this time. And there was 40 reports that were published, and 65% of those were rated as good, 2.5%, so one report was rated as outstanding, 30% were rated requires improvement, and one report was rated inadequate, which was 2.5%. So from these reports, I've got the slide labeled as enforcement, which is slightly misleading because technically action plan requests aren't enforcement. So the only enforcement really was 3 warning notices for Regulation 12, which is safe care and treatment, Regulation 17, which is good governance, Regulation 19, which is fit and proper persons. And this was for the practice that was rated inadequate. For the other practices that requires improvement, action plans were handed out. Now, the difference between a warning notice and an action plan. So an action plan request is where a breach has occurred, but people using the service are not at risk of immediate harm. So it's not technically enforcement as such. It is CQC notifying you as a provider that they consider you are in breach of regulation, and they are not overly concerned as in the fact they have low level risk to patients, and really they have the confidence that they believe you're going to be able to turn this round fairly quickly. So it's more around notifying you they consider you in breach of your legal obligations, and you now need to show them how you are going to comply and when within a reasonable time frame. Now, a warning notice, and I could go on about enforcement in a lot more detail at a later stage if you would like, but a warning notice is a form of enforcement. It is where a breach has occurred, and this is where CQC will give a timescale to a provider to improve, and they will tend to follow up within that warning notice within 3 months of the date that is set. So now I'm discussing kind of the common themes of the 40 inspections. So of the 40 reports, 50% mentioned the management of long-term conditions needed improving. Now, the CQC will run clinical remote searches, and these clinical remote searches are available for you to run yourself. So I've popped the link in here. They are called the Arden searches. It is up to you how often you deem appropriate to run these searches, but don't solely rely on these. Think about other measures you can put in place and other safety netting measures, or you may have different audits that you wish to conduct. But these are the searches that the CQC will conduct, and they are based on national guidance, good practice, safety advice from the MHRA, for example. And if you look at that link, it will take you to where the Arden searches are, and you can have a look yourself. But of those searches, mentioned in 50% of the reports, a lot of them, the most common areas were diabetes, asthma, and hypothyroidism, and the management. So a lot of the reports stated, for example, we found that although the practice had system and processes in place to recall patients for health checks and monitoring, some patients with long-term conditions had not been monitored at the appropriate timeframes. So this is kind of what is mentioned in the reports and what I'm referring to. Childhood vaccinations. Especially with recent news this week on the MMR, it is likely that this will be a continued focus of CQC, and it was mentioned in 35% of the reports published in November to January. The key here is CQC are aware of the difficulties. They will consider your demographics and the context of the practice. Reports will often say, dependent on what you tell the CQC. So for example, you're aware that your uptake is low. These are the steps you're taking. You're improving your appointment availability. Maybe you're offering appointments outside of school hours, for example. You're aware of your practice population needs, and have you got any evidence of this? Because that would be really helpful to show them. But reports will then tend to say leaders were aware of the low uptake and had put systems in place to try to improve the uptake. So for example, notice boards or appointments, like I said, after school. So it's just important that you give them that context. Significant events, it is worth mentioning here that this was mentioned in 30% of reports, and the areas that were mentioned were staff didn't know how to identify a significant event, staff didn't know who to kind of speak to about a significant event, it wasn't documented, for example, the practice didn't have a lead in that area, and it wasn't used to drive improvement. So what you want with significant events is making sure that all staff are aware of what constitutes a significant event, and give them examples. You know, if you've had a data breach, what would you do about it? You know, who would you report that to? Discuss them in your team meetings, discuss them in a one-to-one format. You can decide how you want to discuss a significant event, but ultimately it's about having a learning culture, an opportunity to change. You really don't want a blame culture with this. It's creating that culture of improvement and being supportive. You need to review any themes. Significant events that continuously happen are not a significant event, they're a recurring event, and actually that is bit dangerous, really, isn't it, if you're not learning from those significant events. So make sure that you review any significant events you've had for kind of themes. And with this, evidence is key. So document the process. This is what happened. This is what we did about it. This is how we've shared that with the practice. And this is the steps that we've taken to avoid that happening in future. This is the learning that we've got. So it's around evidencing it. Audits was mentioned in 30% of reports, so make sure that you have a systematic program of clinical and internal audits, so clinical and non-clinical, and make sure that they are a 2-cycle and that they're meaningful. You're not just doing an audit for the sake of doing an audit. Make sure that they are meaningful, that you have a summary of any learning points and an action plan from this, and that you share the audits with your team so that they're aware of you know, any learning from them. For example, the CQC won't necessarily give a list of mandatory audits. There isn't technically a program of audits that you must follow, but you need to, you know, assure yourself, you know, what could we do here? Have you got enough kind of clinical audits around maybe prescribing, for example? Non-clinical, as an example, could be waiting times or record keeping audits. CQC won't necessarily give you an audit list. Complaints. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail around complaints because there was an exceptionally helpful MDU webinar last June, which is available on demand around complaints, and that was fantastic. But really, I'm approaching this from, again, the CQC perspective of making sure that you have the evidence and a clear complaint system in place. So the CQC will want to see when you received the complaint, what the complaint was, that you can see the process, that it was acknowledged, that the policy includes the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman, that the complaints are responded to within the correct time frame, that you are, again, auditing for any themes. So really it's around, again, the evidence of having complaints and making sure that that policy includes the PHSO. Medical emergency equipment. So CQC will not create the standards for providers to follow as such, but they will refer to national guidance, which is the Research Council guidance. Consider this guidance, and if you choose not to follow this guidance, make sure that you have risk assessed. So for example, you choose not to hold a certain medication, and you choose not to because your rationale is that it's expensive or you've never needed it for the past 5 years. So what you need to do really is risk assess. Is that appropriate? So a practice, for example, that was their rationale, and that they had chosen to risk assess this by visiting the local pharmacy, which was 5 minutes down the road. But had they actually considered what would happen if that pharmacy was closed? If it was closed for lunch, or if somebody had to go home early? Or is it appropriate in an emergency for a staff member to, in a very stressed state, be going in a car? Are you delaying medical needs, for example? So really consider, if you choose not to follow the guidance, that you have risk assessed appropriately, that you have regular checks in place of your emergency equipment. It's very common for example, needles to have expiry dates on them. So make sure you're checking all of the expiry dates, that you're checking your medical emergency equipment. Ideally, the AED, so the AED and the oxygen, ideally daily, but at least weekly for your medical emergency, and you've got that oversight. Ensure that all your staff are aware of where and how to use that equipment. And ideally, it should be in one area and it should not be locked away. But that will depend on the layout of your practice. You may be on multiple floors, for example. Ensure that your doctor home visit bags are also checked regularly. Fire is another common area. So fire risk assessments that have been carried out, make sure that they are carried out by a competent person, and consider if you need an external fire risk assessment. That if you have a fire risk assessment, which you certainly should have, but any actions have been reviewed. So just because you have an external fire risk assessment, for example, if that states that you are medium or high risk and you've done nothing about the actions that they've recommended, that's not ideal. So make sure that you review any of the actions, that you check your fire equipment at regular intervals. So monthly fire extinguisher checks. So just a visual check to make sure that they haven't been stolen or tampered with, for example. That you are checking your fire alarms at a regular basis. So weekly for smoke and fire alarms, for example. That you are doing monthly emergency lighting checks, and that your fire equipment is serviced at regular intervals. Again, the EICR, which is the Electrical Installation Condition Report, should be completed every 5 years, and make sure that you are carrying out fire drills. And I've popped in there, Find Bob. This is just a piece of best practice that I saw at a practice where they had drawn a stick figure and hidden it around the practice, and members of the practice would be in a different place each time, but it taught the staff to sweep the building, and it actually made it quite interactive. Legionella, make sure that you have a Legionella risk assessment, that it is completed by a competent person, and that any actions, again, are reviewed the same as a fire risk assessment, that you've reviewed the actions, that any building changes that you have, so for example, if you input a new treatment room, that you update your risk assessment. Any water temperatures, if this is in your control measures, make sure that they are meeting the required levels, and weekly flushing, for example, make sure that's completed. So what you need to do will be identified in your risk assessment and your policy. So make sure that you review that. I appreciate I've now probably just gone quite quick, but I'm just conscious of time. So we may be running a little bit late today. This is a very busy slide here. This is around recruitment oversight, and I'm not going to go into each one in a lot of detail, but make sure that you have assurances that your staff, even if they are not directly employed by you, so if a staff member, for example, is employed by the PCN or the ICB, you are still responsible for ensuring you have adequate oversight, supervision, and that you've assured yourself that the appropriate recruitment checks have been conducted. Now, this could be that you have an agreement with them via a service level agreement or a letter of confirmation or a memorandum of understanding, but just make sure that you have the evidence of that. That you are carrying out DBS checks, and that if for example, a receptionist might not necessarily need a DBS check, but you have risk assessed whether they need that DBS check or not. So for example, if they're going to be carrying out chaperone responsibilities, it's likely you'll need to risk assess if they need a DBS for that. Make sure that you've got oversight of GMC checks at regular intervals, that staff are immunised against vaccines, so staff have got the immunisations which are in the green book, but ultimately just ensure that you are following Schedule 3. Overall governance is another theme. If you have a compliance system, ensure that you adapt your policies to your practice, and having a compliance system doesn't automatically make you compliant. You know, having a compliance system gives you the tools to aid your overall governance, but make sure that you have a systematic approach and that you're maintaining and improving the quality of patient care, that you are updating your policies regularly, that they reflect the processes and what is actually happening in your practice. Staff are aware of how to find the policies and that they're reviewed at regular intervals. Freedom to speak up was another area as well. So staff not aware of when to speak up or who to speak up to, or those appointed, they weren't super keen on speaking to them because maybe they were a family member. So kind of the gold standard would be to have an external freedom to speak up guardian. Again, that could be somebody in the PCN, for example, but making sure that that person really knows actually what the role is of a freedom to speak up guardian, and consider that they're aware of their duty to notify, for example, safeguarding, if any safeguarding comes through, or referring to the police or the General Medical Council, for example. So that's all on themes for the latest reports that we've had. Thinking about now when the inspection has ended, and you can breathe a sigh of relief. And this is where you get the email from the inspector with the draft report, and this is where you can check it. So again, just make sure that you have updated your registered manager and nominated individual email address. Make sure that you reply within 10 working days. And if you make no changes, it's really important to note that if you make no changes, then no changes will be made. So even if you see later on, oh, actually there was a typo, that typo won't automatically be changed. It's down to you to check the report, make sure that you check for typos, any incorrect information, and also anything that you deem to be factually incorrect. And you can also use this as an opportunity to include some additional information which you feel hasn't been considered. It is your responsibility to check that report. Important note, I think this is really important to mention, there is lots of noise available, you know, at the moment at CQC, lots of change that's happened. You know, we've had, where do I begin? The single assessment framework, the regulatory platform, chief executives, you know, new inspectors of primary care, for example. Lots of stuff has happened. And it's important to note that despite all of these changes that have happened, ultimately the regulations have not changed. So I know how it feels to get flustered and think, I have no idea what's going on at the moment. Take a step back, look at the regulations, because they haven't changed. Familiarize yourself again with those regulations. They have not changed. So just some updates of CQC, which I thought would be helpful to mention, but some stuck reports. So these were reports from where they've CQC have been out to a provider, inspected the provider, and they have not been able to publish them. They have reduced from 500 to 4. They are on target with some inspections. Certainly inspection numbers are not what they were a few years ago, but they are starting to improve. There has been a restructure in the leadership team, and there are now chief inspectors, and the actual internal CQC teams have returned to inspectors instead of the inspector and the assessor. And there is plan to review the single assessment framework and publish some new guidance around this. But again, remember the regulations haven't changed. So some practical tips to stay inspection ready all year round, and I'm very nearly done because I'm very conscious of time. But make sure that you are proactive rather than reactive. Again, don't wait for that call. Remember, CQC inspectors can turn up at any time. Look through the CQC Mythbusters. It really is a fantastic resource. It's got all of the links to national guidance on there. You've got your Arden searches on there. You've got the guidance around fire, for example, medical emergencies. It's just a fantastic resource to have. Be professionally curious and look at some reports. So especially if you're interested in going from a good rating to outstanding, what are those outstanding practices doing? So it's worth looking at those reports and kind of filtering to, GP services in the last month. Keep up to date with your communication. So staff meetings, make sure you record and share any learning from them. Keep staff up to date via, you could use email, for example, or WhatsApp or Slack. It depends on what you have. Keep up with servicing of your equipment. That's another area that comes up quite frequently. Just develop good habits. So oversight of recruitment and training, just keep on top of that. And remember, evidence, evidence, evidence. Whew. So I'm just going to take a sip of water. I'm just going to move on to this slide for Rachel, and then I will start to look at some questions.
Great, Jodie. I know that was a very informative presentation. So yeah, I think we just have time for a couple of questions. So we've had quite a few questions from people about DBS checks, and people asking, is there an expectation that DBS checks should be redone throughout a staff member's employment, or does the CQC have sort of look at whether they're being done at regular intervals?
Oh, I've lost where we are on the screen now. Sorry, I've gone down to the question and answer box and now I can't see you. So I'm hoping you can still see me because I can't see you. So going back to the Mythbusters, there's actually a Mythbuster on DBS checks, and you can use the NHS DBS check tool to see who would be applicable at having a DBS check. Now, technically, there is no official expiry of DBS checks. So you need to have your own kind of policy and risk assessment in place. Now, you could, for example, look during an appraisal at maybe, a declaration form. This is just an example, and this could be an example of how you assure yourself. So you carry out that DBS when that staff member starts, and each year during an appraisal, for example, you gain assurances that they sign to say there have been no changes to my DBS. But technically, no, there is no official expiry on a DBS. Obviously, you've got the update service, which a lot of clinical team members use, so you can also gain assurances through that. But technically, no, there isn't an expiry date.
Great. The other question we've had quite a few times was, some people have asked about when the sort of outcome requires improvement, what sort of time scale or time frame would be for re-inspection?
Okay, so that will ideally, in an ideal world, the CQC inspection team will plan to come back as close to that date. So if you are requires improvement, you are likely to have an action plan request or further enforcement, but it's likely to be an action plan request. And on that action plan request, you will put a date that you will deem yourself to be ready for the inspectors to come back. So if you are placing a date on there, be sensible. Now, it can't be a date 3 years in the future, so you need to be sensible with your time frame, and really you're looking at within 6 months. But what I mean by being sensible is also, don't just put next week. You're going to need time to embed those changes. So just be sensible with your approach, but usually they will look to make sure that you have a time frame within 6 months, and they will tend to come back ideally within 6 months after, as close to that date as possible. But being honest, sometimes they are a little bit delayed with that.
Okay, that's really helpful. Another one we've had a couple of questions about is in terms of when the CQC comes, do they choose which staff to speak to, or can practices sort of choose which staff speak to the inspector?
It really depends. So as an inspector, I'm just trying to think of my own personal experience. I would probably choose, and that is usually because those people that I'm choosing are in lead areas, for example. So the safeguarding lead, I would definitely want to talk to those. Who has oversight of training, for example, and they will speak to a cross section of staff. So it's yes and no. If you've got a reason that they can't talk to that staff member, for instance, they have additional needs and they are absolutely petrified, which I have, been to a practice before where that person said, I can't talk to you because I'm so nervous, and there was nothing else, concern of the practice, but they were just petrified. I'm not going to torture that person. There's no need for CQC to torture people, if that makes sense. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, I think we've had a few questions sort of about if people are not going to be there on the day. So one of the questions we've had is about, would you expect all the GP partners to be there on the day?
Not necessarily.
And another one we've had is about if the RM or the nominated individual is going to be absent during a planned CQC visit, how to handle that. So I think, for example, if someone's on a sort of extended period of leave and there's a planned inspection, how best to manage that? Is the expectation for good handover and delegated responsibility, or should they be there?
Yes, you can hand over, and the reason being is the practice is still running, it's still open. So if the practice is still running and open, CQC would expect you to be able to still follow your processes and procedures, and that's where going back to sharing that compliance oversight with everybody is so key. But yes, answering both questions, they can also speak with staff remotely. So, for example, if somebody is away, I have actually spoken to staff who were very willing, may I add. I didn't force them, but they were on holiday and quite willing to speak to me. So I have had kind of, as an inspector, remote interviews with people. So there is that option as well. There is the option as well of a lot of the time, the remote searches will take place on a different date to the inspection. So the GP partner is likely to be available for that. And that's more crucial for the GP partner to be available for, because that is where the clinical searches and a lot of the oversight on the clinical aspects will be. And then the on-site could be, for example, a practice manager on that day, because a lot of that will be around the governance, as an example. So they don't necessarily have to be there. It's helpful to have them, but it's not a reason to cancel an inspection.
Great, really helpful. I think we probably only have time for one more question. So I've just picked one of the ones we've had quite a few people ask about, and it's that I think we're all aware that there's a lot of mandatory training. And I suppose we've had a couple of people asking whether there are any resources to sort of help practices to make sure that they're, up to date and doing that at the right intervals.
So again, I'm going to refer you back to the Mythbusters. Is the question around what training would you expect? Because is that the question? Sorry.
I think it's about saying, is there a list of mandatory training for, practices along with the sort of frequency?
Okay, so there again, refer you back to the Mythbusters, and there's a Mythbuster on training, but really it's not a definitive list. CQC won't give a definitive list as such, because it really depends on the practice, and it's down to the practice to assess and identify their own kind of training needs. But as an example, as a list off the top of my head that I can think of would be basic life support, infection control, fire, safeguarding, mental capacity, information governance, sepsis, understanding of Gillick competency, Fraser, consent, FGM.
So is it more about making sure the training is meeting those sort of points that the CQC inspectors are looking at, rather than a sort of checklist?
Correct, yes. And just assuring yourself, thinking, for example, as a practice, you may carry out minor surgery, so you may have different training needs for that minor surgery. You may have multiple floors, so you may need more fire wardens. So again, it's down to the practice to assess their needs of what that practice is and assure the CQC that they're aware.
Okay, great. I think one more question I thought might be helpful for us to to go through, because I know it's sort of probably a question on a lot of people's, or a lot of practices are looking at, is someone's asked if there's lots of things that the practice is looking at and making improvements on a sort of ongoing basis, would they be penalised if they only sort of had a few months of evidence of that new practice rather than...
Sorry, I don't know if you cut out for anybody else, but
Sorry.
you slightly cut out for me.
Oh, sorry. So I think it was someone was asking, saying that they're, you know, if they're looking at lots of things, trying to make improvements, you know, and then they had an inspection, would it be looked on negatively that they only had, I suppose, a couple of months of that new practice rather than a year's worth, or would the focus be on the fact that they'd made that?
I think the focus is around, making the improvements and being self-aware, and having that oversight of the practice. So an action plan, and a realistic action plan, is fantastic. Obviously, if there is multiple areas which are deemed as breaches, you know, that's slightly different. But if it can certainly help. For example, you're aware, so going back to those, you know, smears and childhood vaccinations, being aware that you're aware that they aren't at the national, you know, low intake, but you are doing this and this is how you're doing. So really it's about mitigating that risk and having that overall action plan of, okay, we know this is happening, this is what we're going to do within a reasonable time frame.
Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for, but hopefully that we've covered some of the more common questions. Thank you again to everyone for joining. I hope it was helpful. So to reiterate that this webinar will be recorded and it will be available on demand on our website within 5 days, and certificates will be sent to your email address within 5 days as well. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.